I feel like I enjoyed season 11 now because of the fact of season 12. I'm like, well, good for them. It was successful enough that the pressure's off.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't feel like I have to be very careful about being too critical because it might somehow jinx the project for the future, you know? I can just enjoy the experience a little bit more and not be anxious on their behalf.
Yeah, we're no longer stress watching the new MST3K.
Exactly.
This time we watch season 11, episode 3, The Time Travelers.
Where the future is fit and pink.
Hey, speaking of pink things, some follow-up.
Do tell.
Well, last time we were discussing time chasers with old Pink Nick and his time-traveling plane, which was alternately referred to as a biplane and a Cessna, and apparently it's neither.
Well, I'm not a plane person, but I should have known it wasn't a biplane because it doesn't have two sets of wings. But I thought it was a Cessna. Well, you know what? I think one of the bots called it a Cessna. I'm like, well, they must know what they're talking about.
See, I thought it was a biplane because it's a plane by. Come on.
It's a plane by?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. But technically, it's an American champion Citabria.
But that's not all. We have also received a letter from Nathan in Missouri on our last episode.
What does he have to say?
And I quote, "Great episode on Time Chasers, one of my favorites. I could totally watch Tangents on Rift." He adds, since you aren't familiar with Rift Tracks, they did Time Chasers as a live show in 2016. Giancola and the cast of the film reunited and saw the riffing together with the others in the theater in Nashville. The film was the uncut version with some extra comedic scenes from the New York cab driver that was probably fine being cut from the MST version. I feel like this show, in particular, is a good gateway to Rift Tracks and a neat way to see how much comedy has changed in 20 years. But more importantly, something for me. Nathan adds that he's slowly working his way through Space 1999, saying, "I think Dragon's Domain is everyone's favorite, with a creepy tentacle monster in it." Now, I'll add that to my list because I was just going to watch the episodes with cool character actors in it, like Pat Troughton and stuff. Or that episode where David Prowse gets hit in the balls with a fire extinguisher. But Dragon's Domain has British that guy Michael Sherd in it. So that and the promise of a tentacle monster is enough for me to get over my season 1 woes and sit down and watch it on the Show Factory site. But I think it's time that we get into a biplane or some kind of tunnel, a time tunnel, if you will, to discuss this episode. This time we watch season 11, episode 3, The Time Travelers. Scientists Carol White and Steve Connors, under the supervision of Dr. Eric von Steiner, have opened a literal window to different time periods. It's basically an interactive TV where you can jump right into the action. This would be fine if our science trio had turned their magic dial to the Beverly Hillbillies so they could swim in the cement pond of Granny and Jed Clampett, but I think they caught an Outer Limits rerun by mistake. The window shows a barren world in the far-flung future of 2071. Proving that any window can be a door if you're dumb enough, Team Science's dim-witted electrician buddy Danny steps through the time portal and runs around like a child dropped off at a Showbiz Pizza Bear play place. Steve and Von Steiner, not seeing the potential market value of monitoring the moron in a blue jumpsuit and forcing him to watch cheesy movies, chase after Danny before the time window collapses. Carol helpfully chases after her male colleagues to tell them the time window's collapsing. Then the time window collapses. Parents, this is what happens when you make your kids go into something practical like science instead of pursuing a liberal arts degree. No forward thinking, no inner life. Anyway, the Time team are chased by hideously scarred mutants and end up in a laboratory hidden in a cave. Don't worry, the mutants can't get in. They've got a no mutants allowed sign or something. The Time trio make fast friends with the survivors of 2071 and their army of Devo-esque androids. Seriously, watch the videos for Jocko Homo or Secret Agent Man and tell me you can't see the connection. The coalition of future friends have built a rocket to escape the hazards of Earth and colonize a new planet, preferably one that hasn't already been bought by Elon Musk. Danny falls in love with a local Nuvina named Rena, who I guess just wants a mate to feel superior to? I don't know. They become mates for life after she plays him a free jazz medley of Moog cookbook tracks on her musical Light Bright. The future friends' attempted blast-off is thwarted by mutants, so they hitch a ride with the time trio as the latter hop through their newly stabilized time travel window. They're back in their own time, but what's this? Earth has changed. The Lincoln Memorial has been replaced by a statue of an ape. Oh no, sorry, it's more complicated than that. Somehow, Time Trio and future friends are now experiencing time at a different rate than the rest of the world, possibly because they arrived a few minutes before their past selves fell through the time window setting up the events in the first place. A quarter hour to them is mere seconds to their past selves. Unable to interact with anything or anyone save each other, post-window Time Trio and future friends hop through the time window once more and end up in a lush Garden of Eden. The end.
Hey, there's 4 of them, not
Yeah.
3.
What? Who's there?
Danny.
He doesn't count. He's no more human than the mutants.
Now on to the episode. The show opens with Jonah and the bots playing the classic pre-teen party game, Never Did I Ever. Tom states that he never did he ever have to breathe oxygen to sustain his existence. Crow notes that never did he ever have to confront his own mortality. Jonah starts feeling picked on. After the intro, the SOL crew presents their invention, a delicious bag of Dr. Crow's edible silica packets. Although one of them is not edible. Guess which one? Meanwhile, Kinga and Max present the Afterlife Alert, where they get messages of distress, or just general grousing, from post-deceased clients. In segment 2, Gypsy and Crow hold a seminar on time safety. The acronym TIME. T, tell someone. I, identify where the portal goes. M, make a plan. E, enter the portal. Not. Acronyms are hard. At the next break, Jonah presents a series of notably similar new robots he's created, each of which incites violent resentment in Crow and Tom. Jonah explains at the end that his creations don't even work, it's just that regular outbursts keep the bots in good working order. In one of the return's most discussed moments, the SOL crew are visited by 2 of the film's future humans, played by head writer Elliot Kalin, and who's this? Joel Hodgson. They play the kind of sleazy Lotharios you imagine would regularly troll neighborhood key parties in the 70s.
Greetings, I'm Dr. Varno, and this is my associate, Larry. We have a very important question for you. Do you cats like to party?
Joel's role as the mute but enthusiastic sidekick has a particular soupçon of menace about it. Finally, Kinga decides to hold an impromptu party to celebrate what turns out to be the 200th episode of MST3K. When Max notes that neither of them were involved in the hundreds of episodes that came before the return, Kinga defensively points out that Disney makes up fake anniversaries all the time for promotional purposes, so she's just getting hers, damn it.
This film could not be more 60s, but I say that as a compliment. It is delightfully 60s.
Is it delightfully 60s to have such strange tonal shifts throughout? Because that's what I found like the most odd. Like when there's basically like a cuddle party right in the middle of what is essentially a race to save humanity.
Yes, because one of the things they basically work 24/7 in this movie, but they do still have time to have their weird love sessions, even though they've got all those great signs that are up where it's like, keep working, it's like only so many more days until the rocket goes to New Eden and all that stuff.
This is a really serious situation where all of humanity is going to be wiped out unless they can make it off the planet. But at the same time, like they have this love session where we find out also the shocker that Carol and Steve are an item, which no hint of that previous to that moment. I found it very shocking. And the fact that often, most of the time, even though there's something very dire and serious going on, the film just enjoys showing you how the pink androids work. Like you could just expect to have some kicky 50s supermarket music playing over like the creation of the eyes and putting all of the androids together and the hijinks turning a circle into a square. Like it's just fun and light, you know? And then we're back to like, oh, there's these mutants that are trying to take us over, and also you're going to die because we can't let you on this ship, you know?
Well, that's part of the joy of it, and it is something that I think you get with 60s sci-fi a lot. I mean, for one thing, like a lot of 60s sci-fi, it breaks everything in the movie to stop for odious comic relief.
Yes.
And we even saw this with Reptilicus. And frankly, seeing the guy who plays Danny in this movie, I was aching for the comedy stylings of Dirk Passer.
Yeah.
Aching.
I mean, he's playing a very recognizable type. Like, I'm not a huge film historian, but I feel like I've seen this guy 1,000 times. Like the slightly nebbishy man-child. It's a kind of sidekick, you know?
It kind of reminds me of when Doctor Who was running on BBC, they got 2 film adaptations. Those were the Peter Cushing Doctor Who's. And in the original series, for those stories that were adapted for films, the characters are shown to be, while not eternal aliens and having the corresponding IQ that goes along with that, they are very smart humans. Like the 2 humans who end up traveling with him are teachers. So they're not total idiots. They just have to ask the doctor questions when there's a bunch of weird future science stuff around. And in the films, or at least one of the films, there's a comic relief character played by comic actor Bernie Cribbins. And he's just there to be the Cockney up to Peter Cushing's austere, reserved intellectual with received pronunciation, so you know he's good and trustworthy. Like, I think that's all too common with science fiction, particularly this period.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because as soon as you described it in that way, the movie I have not seen, this kind of pairing is something you see a lot in 17th and 18th century plays. Where
about time travelers.
Well, it's just, actually you see it all around, but basically before modern times, is you have your heroes and then you have their goofier, more childlike, cartoonish servants that are kind of reflections of them, but, you know, taken down a couple classes. And so they are always your comic relief, and they're reflecting what's happening, but in a very childlike way, because they're servants and they're children. That's why you need to look after them.
Yeah, and that unfortunately like makes sense, because that's just how it is. That's a trend that I think is still there, unfortunately, which is that it is funny to laugh at the lower class.
Yeah, so maybe that's a little bit what's going on. I mean, you have to admit, like, without Danny there, the key mover of the plot doesn't really exist. Like, you need his bumbling to get things going.
That's so lazy, though.
It is really
so lazy. Like, if only there were some reason for them to go in, and it wouldn't have been too hard, even if it was just the second most obvious thing, not the most obvious thing, which would be some idiot wanders in and goes, "Hey, this here's a fancy window," and ends up in the future, and he literally jumps around, and oh god, what a terrible scene. Anyway, you know, if you were to do the second most cliche thing, which would be to have the elderly doctor wander over and goes like, "I simply must know, this opportunity can't be missed," and he jumps through the window,
or he falls out of it because he's old.
And he goes, "Oh dear, I've soiled myself," and then they have to get him, and then it closes. Sure, but it's again, it's the most generic thing, and it's weird. It robs the other 3, the true time trio, not that damn fucker Danny. It robs them of any kind of characterization, because I defy you to tell me who these characters are aside from Danny.
There's the blonde, there's the German, and the gritty tooth guy.
Hey, there's more character development than that, because the blonde's a lady, which is also a defining feature.
There's a German scientist in this movie.
Yes. Why? Can we trust him?
It made me realize just how often that is a trope in the 60s and 70s. You can't really have a scientist that isn't German. And the more I find out about kind of the post-Nazi poach after the defeat of Germany, a lot of scientists were taken over to America so that the Soviets didn't get a hold of them. I always thought this was an interesting idea, because for the longest time I wanted to be a scientist, and I had the acumen for it. But one of the things that intrigued me about, if you were a really brilliant person, it seemed to make you survivable. You know, in any kind of dictatorship or fascist state, who do they kill first? the activists and the intellectuals. But you always got to keep a hold of those scientists.
Yes, they're neither of those things.
I was intrigued in my cowardly way of the innate usefulness of a scientist and how you can't ever, you'd be willing to do things for them to keep their brains.
See, that's just it. I've seen enough B movies to know that you don't want to be a scientist because either A, you are so obsessive that you have been driven mad by your intense desire to do the one thing you've been studying all your life, or the real bad guy, who has no science smarts of his own, locks you up in a lab that you can never escape from, and you're forced to do that person's evil bidding. Those are your two options as a scientist in every movie.
Well, and that's a good point, because Dr. Eric von Steiner actually isn't the obsessed villain in this movie. Arguably, it's Steve Connors, who, growls like a dog when he decides to push the machine past its safeties. I was actually quite is he going to be the villain? And no, it doesn't turn out to be.
No, he's just passionate.
Yeah, okay.
How else are you going to show that when you're just sitting around and pressing buttons and doodads? And I think you'll find that the fine German doctor, or possibly not German, we're not sure. I think he does reveal something of an obsessive thing. It's all the devil's in the details, Beth. Because would a man who is not obsessed have so many Bulova clocks? I ask you.
Good point. You can never trust anyone with a monocle either.
No.
It's also when you think about the fact that they changed into future clothes, but he made sure to hold on to that monocle.
Mm-hmm. And I do love, and again, this I guess makes him a little bit softer as a character in more ways than one, that he gets a Shatner sash, which is where a more plump actor is given this kind of ribbon around their waist to make their undercarriage seem a little more palatable to viewers.
Oh. Another interesting fact about this movie, at least with respect to this episode, is they cut the final couple minutes of this movie for this episode.
And you since sat down and watched it.
Yes, I've seen it, and we will have a link to those last couple minutes in our show notes. It really changes the movie. It completely changes it. And I think it actually makes more sense to have it in there in a weird way, because well, here's the thing. They go back in time, and one of the first things that Carol says is, "Oh, it's the campus." But then she's like, "It looks so forlorn and isolated." And there's no people. And they never explain why that is, but with the extra part that was cut, which, spoiler alert, is basically the film all over again, looping and looping and looping, as it's cut faster and faster. That starts this idea that they've stuck themselves into some kind of other dimension that is slowly falling in on itself. And there are no other living beings in that circle. And so it's just slowly deteriorating until it explodes itself, which is that actually is a little bit more interesting.
I have mixed feelings about that ending, because as an isolated scene, it's quite interesting, but I'm reminded of what happens when you watch deleted scenes from a film on DVD or Blu-ray, or Laserdisc if you're nasty. You end up watching scenes that are perfectly right or interesting in their own way, but detract if they were added. They complicate things in ways that aren't necessary. And by cutting them, you streamline the plot and you make it better. I actually think the misted version, while less kooky and interesting for that ending, the movie's not about a time loop. That's true. And it suggests that it is at the very end. It's almost a revelation, it's a twist. The characters are trapped in this loop forever, but it's that's not what happens. They're just divergent time streams, and they end up in their pleasant future or wherever the hell they end up at the end of the film, and it's over. Their story is over at the end. It's the one part of the movie that's the tricky thing. It's the best made part of the movie, the ending that we don't see in the MST3K cut, because it's very well edited. It's the one time the score comes to life, which had otherwise been quite sedate. Mm-hmm. And it's very well done for accomplishing they're in a time loop, but they really spent no money on that. That's just editing. That's really that's effective storytelling in its way, but it says nothing about the story. It's just an extra kink. And for that to be the last moment of the movie is more distracting than anything else.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It's another example of what is a bit off-putting about this movie, which I think otherwise is kind of interesting. It was an interesting watch, but the androids did not need to be there.
Oh, I disagree. Those androids ruled.
Well, I mean, it was interesting, but for the sake of the plot, not nearly as much time needed to be lavished on their construction, But obviously, the people involved really just wanted that opportunity to do interesting camera tricks.
And that's just it. The magic of the androids, because we see them twice disassembled on camera, once during a mutant revolt at the very end, and another time when a head is replaced on the android, all done in camera. And it's such a good effect that I'm glad they did it twice. It's fun, and it's the only bit of golly gee whiz forward thinking science stuff that you get in the movie, because otherwise, this is why I love the riff when they first step out on the desert planet, that they don't know which Planet of the Apes movie they're in.
Yeah.
And I like that. It's so, really, without the robots, it's just kind of in this blend of Planet of the Apes-like movies, future desert wasteland movies that all kind of look and feel the same. But adding those robots in, it gives the movie a much needed bit of color, albeit that color is pink.
So the episode 2 is a little bit unique because of these very well-known cameos. What did you think of them?
Oh, well, with the cameos, these are the kind of cameos that I want in the show, which is people who work on the show. Anyone else should go away. I don't care. If you had any kind of attachment in the past to the series, or if we're talking about like staff writers or Joel as just, the guy who's overseeing it. I mean, he's in every episode anyway. Mm-hmm. Because he says movie in the hole every episode, and they sometimes use the same clip, which is very noticeable. Mm-hmm. It's not him in that suit, people. I quite liked it. I think that, Elliot Kalin has been doing stage work for a long time. He is a performer, though he is perhaps, at least at the time of MST3K's 11th season, best known for his role as head writer of The Daily Show, but he's a performer. He's always been a performer, in addition to his writing skills. And I think the sketch with him and Joel is delightful for what they're both doing and how complimentary it is, because Elliot's got all of the lines and he's super funny and energetic, and he looks nothing like the actor that he's imitating, which only adds to it. Is just Elliot with a Richard Mulligan wig, and that's funny of its own. But all the idea that character would be a space partier, the head of the 2071 Future Pals, is a space party dude, and he is joined by one of his fellow future friends, which is just a completely mute Joel Hodgson, who just kind of like makes eyes at the camera as if he is flirting silently with Jonah and the Bots for future sex adventures. And it's like, Joel's doing something I've never seen him do, and he's really good at it.
Yeah, I didn't think he had range.
Oh, it turns out he's got a ton of it. This guy is a regular Humphrey Bogart. If I were a man who wrote science fiction stories that no one remembers, they'd have to title my autobiography, They Call Me Mr. Ib. But I've read now in several pieces of criticism about this movie that this is Ib Melchior's best effort.
Yes, we should mention that he also did Reptilicus.
Yes.
And this movie's better than Reptilicus.
If nothing else, this movie's better than Reptilicus, and is also seen as better than his other collaboration with Reptilicus producer Sid Pink, The Angry Red Planet. And like, Ib seems to have been this also ran in 50s and 60s sci-fi, but he's honestly more interesting for what he didn't do, but we'll get to that. The best film that was made from any of his works would be Roger Corman, of course, bought the rights to a Ib Melchior story called The Racer, about racers in the future, and there was nothing really much to that story. I've seen it. But by handing that basic plot to Paul Bartel in the 1970s resulted in the surreal comedy Death Race 2000.
Oh.
Yes, with David Carradine and Sylvester Stallone, a film that is incredibly silly. It is an R-rated wacky races, and it is one of the most delightful films I've ever seen. But Ib has nothing to do with it, why it's so great.
So I haven't seen it, and now I feel like I have to. But does it have that Ib Melchior quality? You know, he has some interesting ideas, and he knows his way around a sci-fi plot. He can't do actors. Like, in both Reptilicus and this movie, like, the actors are just given such flat roles to play. Like, he doesn't seem to know what humans are like.
The original story is, of course, flat as a pancake. But the film is full of colorful characters. David Carradine plays a disfigured race car driver who is always promoted as having his entire body stitched together from different people. So he's referred to as Frankenstein. Sylvester Stallone plays the equivalent of a mob boss in a car. Like, it is wacky races. It's a gory wacky races. And as such is delightful. So it's Ib's best effort by virtue of the fact that Ib had almost nothing to do with it. But I will say, not to totally bury Ib, as I said before, I think The Time Travelers has a lot of charm. I think there's some good ideas in it. It's fun to watch. It's very colorfully made. Ib seems to have a bit of style as a director, even if he's like unable to get actors to do anything other than stand around, be in focus, and deliver exposition.
Yeah, I mean, especially more in this movie, but in Reptilicus too, like, he knows his way around set design. He can set up some interesting shots. I think he just needs someone else to wrangle the actors for him.
Yeah, like, he just has no sense for the human. Although, one of the projects that he worked on would perhaps focus exclusively on non-human characters, or at least more than the other films that we've seen, including Reptilicus, because he would have been the man responsible for the very first American Godzilla movie way back in the 1950s, had a project of his gone ahead. He was working on a project called The Volcano Monsters, which involved essentially a Tyrannosaurus and an Ankylosaur fighting. But what Ib and the people funding the film had decided was, based on the success of Godzilla and how impressive that design was and how those special effects look, why don't we contact Toho Studios in Japan and see if they have any extra Godzilla footage? Turns out, Toho rushed out a Godzilla sequel, much like the King Kong Son of Kong in 1933, coming out the same year as the original King Kong. There was a Godzilla sequel less than a year later. And so they made a deal with Toho: give us all your Godzilla footage, and if you don't mind, send us your monster suits, and we'll return them once we're done. And this was all part of Ib's plan to make The Volcano Monster. So we would have had an American Godzilla movie. But funding fell through, and when Toho started looking for its Godzilla suits, they just turned up missing.
I had a feeling that wouldn't go well.
Nope. And Ib has never commented on the matter, for shame. But essentially, that was the original Godzilla suit, slightly modified for a new movie. So this piece of history just got lost because people plumb forgot about it.
Wow.
And that just sucks. Now, you think that might be Ib's sole brush with franchise fame, but you'd be wrong. Because Ib was behind a little TV series that was to be called Space Family Robinson.
Really?
Any guesses as to what that turned out to be?
Lost in Space?
Yes. But here's the problem. Lost in Space is not Ib Melchior's Lost in Space, despite what Ib Melchior will tell you.
Okay.
Ib had written a script called Space Family Robinson that essentially had the same basic concept, and he had even registered it as a script and had it copyrighted 5 months before the other Space Family Robinson was registered. So Irwin Allen created Lost in Space, the Lost in Space that everybody knows, and went ahead filming that. Ib threatened to sue, but knew that, or felt that, any attempt to block Irwin Allen would just result in getting blackballed from the industry. So he just sat on that and remained forever bitter. And you'd think that's kind of where his involvement with Lost in Space would end. But that's not the case.
Was he involved in the 90s remake with Matt LeBlanc?
Now, as crazy as that sounds, yes.
What?
So, the only thing that Ib had his fingerprints on is the thing that's worse than the Lost in Space series, the series that is notorious for being terrible.
Oh, no.
As it turns out, completely out of the blue, an independent production company called Prelude called Ib, and they were developing the Lost in Space movie. It was from a script that they had originally optioned and developed to revitalize the franchise as a movie series. Great idea. And they called Ib thinking that he had a similar project in development at Disney at that same time. I don't know who spread that rumor because Ib was not working for Disney at that time, nor was he developing Lost in Space projects. But he told them that he was the true creator of Lost in Space. And they just went along with it. So they were going to pay him a great deal of money to buy the rights to something that Irwin Allen would have owned.
How long did that get strung along?
Well, somehow the more well-known New Line Cinema enters the picture. They're the ones who distributed the 90s Lost in Space. And they must have made a settlement with Allen because, of course, there was a lot of revitalization of Lost in Space as a brand when the movie was coming out. Reruns were frequent in the mid-90s, and there were many new interviews with the surviving cast. But Ib is brought on as essentially the script supervisor. He's going to be the man shepherding this project as far as his deal with Prelude goes. But when New Line Cinema enters the project, the following things happen. Ib has no say in the script.
Okay.
He said he made exactly one change, which is that there was supposed to be a scene in which Matt LeBlanc hangs out of an open spacecraft and is prevented from being sucked out into space by hanging on to his army dog tag. And Ib said that that's physically impossible. That's too stupid to put in a movie. That's the one thing they changed. All the other times he said this, they ignored it. Which is why the Lost in Space movie is about Matt LeBlanc, a cartoon monkey.
No, I think that was a baseball movie, wasn't it?
That was Matt LeBlanc had a storied career of playing with monkeys. All the great primates worked with Matt LeBlanc at one point or another. But Ib is completely steamrolled in order to get this movie made and to make it 90s schlock. And it sinks like a stone and is forgotten. And New Line Cinema, since they're in charge of the project, said, actually, you never had a deal with Prelude because we're the ones who put out the movie, and the movie was a flop, so we're not going to pay you. And so all the promises of getting back payment from Prelude for having his concept stolen and all of this, and how he's the true creator of Space Family Robinson, all fell to nothing by the time the film was released in 1998. He did sue this time, and the case was completely dismissed. So maybe it was just a matter of misinformation and ego this entire time.
Hollywood's a tough town, baby. There's another individual that I think we should spend some time on, and he is probably one of the smallest roles in the film, but one of the more striking, and that is Peter Strudwick.
Yes, he's easily one of the better actors in the movie in that he doesn't say any dumb lines, and he's interesting to look at.
Right. So he's
neither mutant nor man, according to the dialogue in this movie, which is weird.
So I should mention, Peter Studwick, his mother...
He's quite the Studwick.
He's a good-looking guy. So his mother contracted rubella when she was pregnant, and so he was born with some missing fingers and feet. So apparently, Peter Strudwick wanted to be in this movie and asked to be one of the mutants.
Mhm.
And he seems to be being used as a way to show that our heroes are maybe more sympathetic and morally evolved than their future counterparts, because Carol's like, this person deserves to be taken care of. We shouldn't throw him out like a dog just because of the way he looks, and then he spends the rest of the movie following Carol around like a lovesick puppy. So it kind of erased that line about him deserving respect, but whatever. It's a strange moment in the movie, very intense, but might be one of the most powerful as a result.
Yeah, it's the closest thing that this film comes to being Star Trek. You have a plea for tolerance and a thinly veiled comment about how, despite how people look, we are all the same inside in a science fiction vehicle. And it's funny that would be really powerful if that's what the movie was about. But the hypocrisy and the potential unpleasantness of the 2071 survivors is never explored again. Nor do they seem to object to having this guy join them once Carol makes her case.
It's very quickly resolved, and then everyone just kind of moves on.
I'd say that's classic Ib. That's classic Ib Melchior, in that there's something interesting in an otherwise forgotten movie.
It's just also fascinating to think about how far disability rights have come since then, and how grateful I am for disability activists for all their hard work, because we live in such a more moral and considerate world for everybody, because they've forced us to think about what ableism assumes about people. In an ableist world, nobody's allowed to be vulnerable in any way. And that's not just for people who look physically different, but mentally different people as well. And I feel like the reason that it's more socially acceptable to say that you have depression or anxiety has a lot to do with the work that disability activists have done to kind of crack open these ideas of what normal is.
And what's interesting is that Strudwick, in his own way, was a part of that. I don't know if he was that active on the activist side of things, but what we see from him in a 1981 documentary called Being Different, which turns out to be a CanCon production, that's a fascinating time capsule, because while the film is not as exploitative or wrong-headed as, say, Mondo Kani, it's still really dated, but it's dated in an extremely earnest way. You have people who are born with different physical differences, for lack of a better term, being interviewed, but usually being interviewed from the perspective of, do you regret not being normal?
Yes.
Which is that's an interesting shift in perspective. Like that's, I guess, really the height of ableism, in that you see yourself as the default. And that's why we used to consider anyone with any kind of physical difference as being disabled rather than differently abled.
And othered, which I haven't seen this movie, but you did share the trailer, which I'll put on the
that
show
trailer
notes.
is scary, and I don't know why.
Because it others them. It
Yeah.
turns, it's very much we, the normies, and them, these unknowable imitation humans. It had that feel. Like, it was really disturbing.
Yes.
And, but it sounds like maybe the documentary was a little bit more complicated than that.
Well, you get a sense of how it was marketed and what the movie's actually like in the trailer, and there'll be a link in the show notes. The first half of the trailer, you hear a bit of the cheesy inspirational music that's featured in the film, and you see on-screen narrator Christopher Plummer talking about how we should look at how our lives would be different if we had any of these physical differences. And then we immediately cut to someone in shadow walking up, and you hear heavy breathing on the soundtrack, and
I know.
entering the door, and it's done like it's quite effectively edited, because he walks into his own home, and rather than hearing his normal voice as you hear in the movie, where he simply says hello to his wife, the sound cuts and being different shows up. And of course, the man in question, who was featured on the poster, has the condition, I think it's progeria, where you experience these kind of extensive growths on your body. And in this man's case, his face.
It's kind of like elephantitis.
Yeah.
But yeah, what really struck me about this movie is that Peter Strudwick's character as the not mutant, not human is not allowed to talk. And I haven't seen the documentary, but I assume that Christopher Plummer is the host, who is the filter through which the assumed ableist audience is permitted to cross over, right? Like, they can't be their own advocates, really.
Well, no, the film lets them speak. I mean,
Okay.
Christopher Plummer is just there to provide transitions. His role in the film is strictly like promotional, in that you can say this is a film with Christopher Plummer in it, and to provide transition material between these long interviews. The closest thing I would say that the movie gets to being objectionable from my own perspective is one, the extreme cheesiness of the ballads about the importance of being different, which is way too try hard, even in 1981. But also that, as I said before, the line of questioning often goes, even if it's just to reveal the surprise answer from an ableist perspective, is to ask people, do you regret your life, or are you filled with bitterness because you're different? And the answer is always no. So
Yeah,
we can't imagine living a different way.
So Peter Strudwick was known as the Footless Runner. He took up marathon running.
Honestly, I'm impressed and a little intimidated that this man, in any week of his life, has done more running than I have in my entire life, despite the fact that he had no feet.
Yeah, I'm not a runner either. I hear you.
I like it, but I'm also quite lazy.
I am not a runner. My body does not like it. I feel like I'm going to physically fall apart at the end of a run.
Yeah, like one of those cool androids in this movie.
Yeah, just take off my legs. They don't work anymore.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
It's time for the Shallow 13. 13 tiny temporal anomalies about the time travelers. Go, Beth, go!
Let's start by clearing up some potential confusion. This is not the 1976 project, Time Travelers by Irwin Allen. That failed pilot-turned-movie of the week concerned time travelers collecting a cure for a future plague in Earth's past. It was an attempt to reboot his 1960s series The Time Tunnel, and despite a story by Rod Serling, it bombed. And yes, Rod Serling and Irwin Allen worked together. The 70s were super weird.
Also, don't confuse this with its 1967 remake. That's right, just 3 years after Ib Melchior's film was released, David L. Hewitt, who co-wrote the original story with Melchior, offered his own spin on the story as Journey to the Center of Time. This version features incredibly low production values and lots of shots of people standing around, but it does have a few frames of a lizard playing a prehistoric dinosaur, so 4 stars.
The Time Travelers was one of Vilmos Zsigmond's first gigs as a cinematographer, which is why this movie looks a lot better than it has any right to. The Hungarian-born Zsigmond has been nominated for 4 Academy Awards for Best Cinematography. This includes Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Deer Hunter, The River, and Black Dahlia.
Zsigmond was also the cinematographer for one of the most notorious flops of all time, Heaven's Gate. That 1980 epic western lost so much money that it also took down its parent company, United Artists.
Danny, the theoretically lovable doink who accompanies our heroes, is played by Stephen Franken. Franken's most famous role was Playboy dilettante Chatsworth Osborne Jr. on the early 60s sitcom The Many Lives of Dobie Gillis. The yachty Boston accent that Franken used would be recycled by Jim Backus's character a few years later on Gilligan's Island, creating a familiar archetype, the New England elite, that influenced characters like Major Charles Winchester III from MASH, Fraser Crane from Cheers, and Arthur Duvall from Catalina Caper.
Tell them about it, Lawrence. Mary Anders, who plays Carol, also acted in Women of the Prehistoric Planet, which was riffed in Season 1 and is the source of the infamous Haikiba bit. She's also remembered for her appearances in the color revival of Jack Webb's Dragnet, albeit without her blonde hair. Webb allegedly ordered Anders to dye her hair brown so that her character, policewoman Dorothy Miller, would appear more intelligent.
Forrest J. Ackerman cameos in the film as a technician who turns circular pieces of metal into squares. Ackerman, who edited the magazine The Famous Monsters of Filmland, gave the time travelers plenty of extra press for that, and sure enough, later B-movies would toss Ackerman a cameo in the hopes of some positive publicity.
The Time Travelers also features the finest performance by a basketball team this side of the Harlem Globetrotters on Gilligan's Island. Many of the mutants were played by members of the Los Angeles Lakers.
Jonah and the Bots compare Rena's trippy musical number to Esquivel.
Of all the music that could have survived Doomsday, only Esquivel made it?
Juan Garcia Esquivel is best known for his late 50s and early 60s space-age bachelor pad music, a type of Latin lounge music that incorporated lots of novelty sounds and elaborate light shows.
The scientists test their equipment by looking at day-old versions of themselves in the Institute parking lot. Crow says they're watching Heavy Metal Parking Lot, the classic 1986 mini-documentary by John Hain and Jeff Krulik that explores heavy metal fans tailgating before a Judas Priest show. The directors followed this up in 1996 with the less celebrated Neil Diamond Parking Lot.
Crow also mistakes the androids for Zippy the Pinhead, the protagonist of Bill Griffith's Underground's comic strip, Zippy. As the name suggests, Zippy was microcephalic and was indeed inspired by the Pinheads in Todd Browning's seminal 1932 film Freaks. And apologies for the naming here. Zippy's 70s heyday was not the friendliest time, and that goes double for the 1930s. The strip became a cult hit thanks to Griffith's detailed art and Zippy's penchant for non sequiturs like, "I just became one with my browser software," and "all life is a blur of Republicans and meat."
Zippy fun fact number 12. The ubiquitous catchphrase, "Are we having fun yet?" was first uttered by Zippy in 1979. Like Robert Crumb's Keep On Truckin', the phrase was widely bootlegged on t-shirts and posters for decades. The absurd line, which preceded a song Zippy wrote about fishnet stockings, was used as a lazy punchline over the years, ending up in the mouths of Ziggy, Garfield, and Dennis the Menace, to name a few.
And finally, at one point, Tom starts singing Somewhere Out There.
Somewhere out there.
This had previously been featured in a heartwarming episode of Community when Troy and Abed sing it in the hopes of finding a lost mouse. Community, of course, is home to MST3K alums Justin Roiland, Rob Schraub, and Dan Harmon.
And that's time. Are we having fun yet?
So, Adam, this movie basically shows that the world has been completely ruined by 2071. And of course, it's by nuclear war because, climate change wasn't on the radar yet. And only about a handful of people are left, maybe 100. So the future's pretty bleak.
As it should be. Each decade more bleak than the one preceding it. I think that's more to, this movie's roots as a ripoff or reimagining of the Time Machine.
Right, which has a bleak ending and then an even bleaker ending after that.
It's like Clue, where you get to choose your ending.
I just remember at one point when I was studying the book Utopia by Thomas More, which, spoiler alert, turns out to be a dystopia.
Oh no!
And in the modern era, we have a very, very hard time imagining utopia. Whereas, in medieval times, people were very, heaven focused, right? It was something that a lot of people, and to some extent a lot of Christians, still feel this way, that they're looking forward to the apocalypse because all the good people get to be rewarded, right? So it's something to look forward to as the future.
And it's escape from the horrible world that you are currently in, which you hate.
True enough.
So that's, I guess, a good way to justify existence when you can't find joy.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if you live in a crappy present, maybe thinking about the future as being better is a way to mitigate those feelings. But I feel like that happens less. I mean, I, myself, am a very anxious person, and anxiety is basically just fear for the future. So I don't know if I'm representative here. But I have a hard time thinking that the future is going to turn out.
That's the realm of science fiction right there. And what we see here is ultimately a triumph of science. Science can solve all of our problems, even if it creates an initial entire plot of a film as a bad thing, as a mistake. It's still the solution. Like the solution, like the problem and the solution is to go through the time window at the end, because they ultimately end up in the future, years and years and years later, where Earth is actually fine and is now blissful and wonderful, and we have all these Adams and Eves and Danny to repopulate the Earth. Even though, to me, the bleakest future is having Danny sire a child.
Yeah, Danny gene pool.
Ugh.
Which is funny. Like, the ironic thing is the ideal future is a return to the past, right? An Edenic kind of pre-human state.
And there's always this weird idea that we're evolving in terms of, society and our own minds and technology. All of those things are changing, but they're changing too quickly, which is why we have to pull this big reset button and maybe start from scratch, knowing the things we know now, which to me is just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But that's a surprisingly common theme of, like, shut Earth down, modern Earth, or thinly disguised modern Earth as future Earth is always seen as bad.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point. That the reset button is kind of built into a lot of people's thinking about what needs to be fixed. I mean, basically, that's what revolution is, right? Like, shut it all down, let's start again and do it right this time.
Why has there never been a movie that featured space guillotines? I ask you. So how many of these 7 deadly sins have you checked off in your life, Beth?
Well, I think I've hit them all, frankly. This piqued our interest because Kinga and Max, when they are presenting their invention exchange, the afterlife alert, most of their discussions with their clients seem to happen in purgatory. Now, if you're not familiar with purgatory, it is a concept of the afterlife that some Christian sects believe in. I think maybe it's just the Catholics now. I describe it as like a delousing chamber. Like, you're not bad enough to go to hell, but you still got these sins because everybody sins. So we got to wash them off and do some time before you can move on to heaven, which has no place for sin. But anyway, I got really happy because the one author who, attempted to map out purgatory as a place, as well as hell and heaven, was Dante in the Divine Comedy. And that is definitely what they're referencing here with the different levels that are split up by the 7 deadly sins.
Yes, and then this is, of course, Dante's most famous work. Many consider it Dante's peak.
That's funny because Purgatory is a mountain. Not too many people have read Purgatory. Inferno tends to be the blockbuster, but it was my favorite.
But see, the networking opportunities in hell must be endless. So really, what's the better thing? The gated community of heaven or the luxury high-rise that is hell? I choose hell.
Well, Dante's theory, as he's going through, hell at first is very compelling for that reason. It has very, very interesting individuals that end up down there who are trapped by their own personalities. Hell is not other people. Hell is your own ego. And what purgatory does is teaches you to think in sync, not only with other people, but with basically God. So it's very disturbing for people growing up in an individualistic society, but you see all these souls in purgatory going around in 2s and 3s and just kind of like being more like sheep, being willing to be guided.
And hence, of course, always the flock imagery in Christian writings.
Exactly.
And see, that's kind of interesting. To me, I'm very horrified by the idea that purity and goodness is collective thought and hell is oneself.
Yeah.
I don't abide by that at all.
Which is interesting because it's coming from Dante, who's a very strong ego, but he somehow works out, and this is why I think everybody should read this, that you can maintain your personality while still aligning it to a more godlike way of thinking. And one of the ways that you get to that is you work on these sins that kind of push you back into your individuality. Maybe we should go through what those 7 deadly sins are. You want to name them?
Ooh, there's some favorites here that we can bring up. Why, at number 7, we have lust.
Yeah.
At number 6, gluttony. Number 5, greed. Number 4, sloth. Number 3, wrath. Number 2, envy. And the number 1 sin is pride, which means all lions are in hell.
Is there any particular sin that you feel really aligns with your personality?
Well, I mean, I think that really, gluttony and lust are the same sin.
Get it inside of me.
Yeah. And as such, I'm just a classic 67. 6 and 7 is all about it. Because, people can have all the money. I like being active. I'm not particularly wrathful. Nor do I find envy to be a particular issue with me. And the only pride I'm interested in are the marches. Thank you.
I, on the other hand, I think I would say I'm most aligned with...
Wrath?
No, although I do get angry, but envy. It's a
Yeah.
tough one for me. And I find envy interesting because envy gets confused with jealousy. So the difference is envy is wanting what someone else has, where jealousy is wanting to destroy what that person has that you don't.
Yes, and jealousy is way more relatable. Don't you want to see your enemies destroyed, Beth?
It's interesting that you've tied gluttony and lust, because I feel like pride and envy can sometimes go together.
And don't these both come from a wrathful place? I really think we can simplify these deadly sins to be about 3. Pride, envy, wrath is 1. It's a Ghidra, the 3-headed monster of sins. And gluttony and lust, well, that's obviously the same thing. And then, really, greed could be thrown in there as well, I suppose, into the gluttony and lust angle. It's just wanting stuff. So really, we've got those 3, the other 3, and sloth. I've never seen a wrathful sloth in my life.
It's true.
Chris, I fear if we continue this episode, it's just going to end up looping over itself. So please rescue us from the purgatory that we're in and give us one last final fact about the time travelers.
I'm not going to give you a final fact about the time travelers. I'm going to give you a different kind of final fact. Because in this episode, they make a bit of hay about this being the 200th episode. So, off the top of your head, no cheating, no looking anything up. What was the 100th episode?
Oh.
The 100th episode was The Wild World of Batwoman.
Laser blast? Because that would be ironic.
Okay, Adam is much closer.
Okay.
The Wild Wild World of Batwoman was episode 110. Episode 100 was The Magic Voyage of Sinbad.
Oh.
Season 5, episode 5.
And Adam wins. Wait, none of us win. Are we doing Price is Right rules?
Price is Right rules. The correct answer would have been, as always, Star Force Fugitive Alien 2. If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you're an android, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com. We're on Twitter at itisjustashow, and we'd love to hear from you. The show is made possible by listeners like you. You can support us and hear some bonus bits by going to itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And you know what would be nice? It'd be really nice if you left us a nice review on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever you listen to us. Just write us a nice review. Give us a bunch of stars. That would be great. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today on It's Just a Show, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/47.
Well, speaking of arbitrary legacy celebrations, our next episode is going to be our 48th. Hooray! What are we going to do to celebrate?
You know what? This time machine that we've been in for the past few episodes, I think it's finally coming to a rest. I can feel the time flow slowing us down. Oh, yep. Let's poke our heads out of the windows and see where we've landed. Let's see. Looks a bit 19th century out there. Beth, you might be excited. Wait a minute. Wait. I think I smell gold. And sausages? Well, tarnation if it isn't Season 5, Episode 10, The Painted Hills, with short body care and grooming.
Body care and grooming. They're cops.
Is that the one with Lassie?
Yes. And Pylon Pete. 2 unforgettable characters in the MST3K canon.
I don't remember very much about this beyond Lassie.
I remember this being a delightful episode. Season 5 is a very solid place to be. And we get a short, which we haven't tackled in a dog's age.
But until then...
Don't count your mutants until they've destroyed your rocket ship.
And remember, when God closes a time door, he opens a time window.
Take it away, Theme Squad.
the bot. That's a way of then
Don't know this myth
for him.
that, hip.
Complicated.
I like Brown. I think that's
Basically, that's more.
Wild.
I and the when
don't this
for
that, Brown. I think
basically
Wild.
and
Wild.